This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, my guest is Michael A. Wood Jr. He is a former Baltimore, Maryland police officer. We'll be talking about policing in the 21st century and ethics in America, and that will begin in a moment. When I was a young boy, one of my heroes was a man named Frank Serpico, and they made a movie about him called Serpico, starring Al Pacino. And I know my father was always a big fan of Serpico, and he wondered why weren't there more Serpicos. The man that you see before me could probably be best described as a 21st century Serpico. His name is Michael A. Wood, and I will be linking to his website below, michaelawoodjr.net. He is a former Baltimore, Maryland police officer who has written about corruption in that force that he used to work for. And I want to welcome him and ask him if he could give a little bit of background about himself before he became a police officer. Did you come from a family of policemen? Did you come from a family of very religious background? Where did you develop your sense of ethics, that kind of thing? So a little background, please, Michael.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on and asking kind of these nuanced questions that get to the heart of what the matters really are. And I grew up in one of those mixed race, subsidized housing suburbs that are right outside of Baltimore. I don't know, everybody's struggling, working class kind of deal. And the policing aspect came in, like so many other kids think, right around my age, is you're sitting there watching cops, on TV like 3 or 4 times a day, and you see them chasing the bad guys, and society tells you that, the police are good, and that's who you turn to, and that's what you should want to do. You should aspire to be this character that's on TV, and he's going down and chasing down these drug dealers and things like that. So I guess really that's where my policing aspirations really would have been rooted in. And so I grew up, went through high school, and I really wasn't ready to. I don't think I was personally ready to take on the world. So I decided to be more mature. I needed to go to the Marine Corps. A path to college and a path out of those kind of working class environments has traditionally been to go and serve in the military, get your GI Bill, and then move on to your career. And that's kind of the path I was following, which we can talk about later, but it's quite a gross path when you really analyze what that means in itself. But then my skills, obviously, from being a Marine, they really only transition into one thing. And that's what I always wanted to do anyway, right? Was be a cop and go chase those bad guys and have the adrenaline thrill of that interaction. I don't know, that's kind of sewn into our cops and robbers zeitgeist.
Well, let me ask you about being in the military, because since 9/11, there has been sort of this, John Wayne rallying cry about anyone in uniform, be it the military, be it firemen, be it police officers, be it local sheriff's deputies, that they can do no wrong. I grew up when the Vietnam War was raging. There were things like the My Lai massacre and whatnot. This caused a lot of dissension. Where did you serve, and how well received were you if you were serving in either Iraq or Afghanistan, or were you stateside?
Yeah, I mean, my service doesn't really count as much as any others. Now, it has led me to be the executive director of Veterans Stand and uniting veterans for a different cause in the nonprofit that I have now. But, I mean, really, my experience, being that same kid that was going for the adrenaline thrill, I went to the recruiter and I opened up the book and I saw these guys roping up on a ship and, like, taking over the ship, and they had MP5s, and, like, I said, I want to do that. Like, what is that? So that was Fast Team, and that's what I ended up doing. I went in, had to go through infantry and go through a bunch of, year of training to go into Fast Team. And the Fast Team is the anti-terrorism unit that is like the SWAT team for the Marine Corps. So they're dispersed around the world and don't really have anything to do with combat. If combat goes on, then we still need to protect the back door and do other SWAT team stuff around the world. So we're kind of isolated away from the rest of the military. And we were super highly trained. I mean, it's not Force Recon or SEAL team, but really well-disciplined unit that I don't know. It was just a different beast. We didn't have that kind of in-your-face conflict, because by the time we were there, it was usually like, oh no, Fast Team is here, so everybody would stand down.
I grew up in what I could best describe as sort of a Goodfellas kind of environment in urban New York, in along the Brooklyn-Queens border. There were a lot of mafia-type guys. And when people think of corruption, they usually think of a cop who's on the payroll of a drug dealer or a mafia don, someone who's, doing all kinds of things for profit. But to me, corruption starts at the base when you're, say, just a parking officer, and you have to meet a quota, and you're 20% behind on the tickets that you're giving out this month, and your sarge is riding you. And I know, for example, I later moved to the Minneapolis area and worked in a county court, and some of the bailiffs were ex-cops, and they often talked about having to meet quotas. Before we talk about the big things like the Freddie Gray, what we call modern 21st century hunting black men, or the old-fashioned Serpico type corruption, do you think that the problem starts at this very base level in policing, where there are pressures put on police, for example, to bring in money rather than actually, write a ticket for genuine reasons?
Yeah, sure. So I would flip that around and say that the problem is not at the bottom at all. The problem is at the top, and that's the entire structure of policing that ruins it and corrupts it, and no matter which way you go. And just a lot of other aspects in life. If you're blaming the officer is a pawn in the system, just like a criminal is a pawn in the system. They are the ones that have pressures on them and have these, like you're saying, with quotas. I mean, you don't have official quotas, but it's political pressures. So the real corruption in policing is at the political level. That's just expressed by these actions of officers, just like it is with criminals. So we always have to ask ourselves, even when it comes to cop that steals from a drug dealer and robs drug dealers, if we talk about any crime, you say to yourself, why did this person commit the crime, or why don't they commit the crime? And it's either because they want to, or they need to, or they don't want to, or they don't need to. So the pressures that come on them are what puts you in a position to want or to need to do these certain things. And we look at the person that receives the pressure instead of looking at the person that sends the pressure down. And that's why policing in this country has been like stagnant for the last 50, 60 years.
So that's a good point. So let's talk about, if just in general terms, and if you were, say, put on a presidential commission to look into police corruption or something like that, and you were looking at, let's just start with the major cities, the Chicagos, the New Yorks, the Baltimores, the Miamis, the LAs, Bostons, Philly, would you say that what is needed is somehow to reverse the thing? Would, say, a community action groups that can hold police accountable be something to start with, or would they inevitably fall corrupt too and become sort of a witch hunts, do you think?
No, so for anyone that wants to look up my solution to this, I'm a police scientist. I just happen to have been a cop. I have a model called the civilian-led model, and that's very much what you're talking about. It's based on stakeholder theory, establishing the actual representatives from the community that can come in and direct what the police department does. Because the problem is so through my police science, and where this really comes down is that American policing is unique from policing anywhere else in the entire world. And it's partially because our country formulated in a unique way than anywhere else in the entire world. And that's that policing does one of three things at all points in time. It is either the creation and maintenance of an oppressed class. The second thing it does is it values elite property over the lives of American citizens. And the third thing it does is the continued genocide of the Native American people. So that is expressed so obviously in policing, and that's because of the interactions and the intensity of the situations as an expression of what our country really is. Those are the three things our country was founded on and continue to be rooted in. So when you have the idea of a police oversight board for accountability, even that's a weird thing, because what we're saying is that you have some kind of authority as a community to judge all the bad things that the cop does, but for some reason we don't trust you to judge all the good things that the police do. So we have to put them all the way at the top. It's not about misconduct. It's about totally getting away from the political system, having a police department serve their community. No mayors, no governors. They have to actually directly serve the community. So for the first time, you're asked, how do you want to be police? What do you want your police to do? Because in American history, throughout every single place in this country, they have a legitimate argument. They think they're having a legitimate argument about selecting which person will police them. And that's just morally corrupt at its root.
Yeah. since you mentioned the police silencing, we're recording this in the year 2017. If we went back one century exactly to 1917, a lot of minorities, especially blacks, were coming northward to the big cities, and they were moving into neighborhoods that were slowly integrating. You probably know a name of a man named Robert Moses, who was a guy in New York City who helped create modern ghettos in that he was an urban planner who would put highways through integrated neighborhoods, and this led to redlining of communities that a black couldn't move here, a Jew couldn't move there. Even Italians or Poles, Eastern European people would be ghettoized. So if we're talking about getting to the root of the problem, do you think that integrating a lot of the big cities is a solution? Because I would assume that Baltimore is like a lot of the other big cities in that there are still ghettos rather than integrated neighborhoods.
Well, I mean, then you're getting into the bigger pictures of redlining, going into the past, and housing things and taking wealth out of the community. I don't really think policing can solve those issues, but what we can do is we can at least be a mitigating factor so that if we set up systems that say, the areas that get the most police service, coincidentally, are the ones that are the poorest and actually don't really need that kind of police attention because you just end up putting people in jail and creating a cycle of environmental poisoning and loss of jobs and all those things that that come from ghettoized communities. So I even lost that train of thought. Where was I even going?
You were talking about money and money being siphoned out of communities' ghettoization.
Right. So what we have to do is circumvent those things by making the police, they would be a strong stakeholder. So we have to use the police to circumvent all those dumb things. So the federal government and governments in general don't fight the number one thing that is correlated to violent crime reduction. So it's the biggest thing we have to talk about in anything that comes to policing. The epic crime reductions in this nation came from the 1972 and 1973 laws taking lead poisoning out of paint. Lead out of gasoline. That started our precipitous drop in violent crime around the entire nation. This is highlighted no more better than in New York City itself. So in that same period in the 70s, the New York City Public Health Department was the best public health department in the nation in attacking lead poisoning and getting it out of New York. So New York has one of the lowest lead poisoning levels of any major city in the United States. Coincidentally, not coincidentally, they also have the lowest crime rate of any of these major cities because they have taken the number one correlate to violent crime out of the system, and it has a 22-year delay. So when they did that in the 70s, 22 years later, you see this epic crime reduction in New York that everybody attributes to the buffoon that misinterpreted what broken windows as a theory even is and completely misapplies it. And that's what gets the credit for it. But really, this epic crime reduction in New York took place not because of policing, rather in spite of policing. And policing was doing everything it could to hurt the public health aspects that were changed in New York from that violent crime. Right now, there's over 3,000 cities that have more lead poisoning than Flint, Michigan. These are all continued cases where you're going to see 22 years down the line increased violence or violence maintaining in these neighborhoods. And if we had a police department like we're talking about that would say to you, what do you want us to do? And we looked at the science, you would say, fight lead poisoning. No shit, it's a no-brainer. But we don't do that because we serve politicians who only have 4 to 8 year goals, which never align to a 22-year one.
It's interesting you mentioned that. Is that because lead poisoning leads somehow to some kind of retardation of the brain, the way the brain works, or creates more violence within young males or something?
Right, so it affects your impulse control, and it makes it, you have lower test scores, and it lowers your IQ. So that obviously makes it so you're not going to be able to do his job as well. You're not going to succeed in school as well. It's a kickoff cycle. Freddie Gray was a lead poisoning victim and had high lead levels still when he was killed. So was Corin Gaines in Baltimore. A lot of these victims are lead poisoning, and that's just an expression of how this system comes together, and you see these people that really didn't even do anything wrong, but they're lead poison victims in an area where the police are fighting and going after them as a symptom and not after the thing that's causing the whole goddamn thing. We know it as a concept super easy if you think about like an armed robbery. So that's an idea everybody can conceptualize. There's a bank robbery, you want the police to prevent these things, and you don't want to be robbed in a bank. That's the goal, right? But what your police department does when somebody robs all these resources to figuring out the details of that crime so that they can put that individual in a cell somewhere else. None of that did anything to prevent you being robbed the next time around. The fundamental question should be, why did this person commit the crime? Do we need to protect society from this person going forward? And what can we do to prevent those scenarios and situations that led up to this individual having to rob this bank that put everybody at risk? It's the exact, every time an airplane crashes, we do this quick reconstruction to make sure it never happens again. But when we have a mass murderer go in and kill 50 people, we do no reconstruction to figure out how it never happens again. It's baffling. Criminal justice and policing is a religion and an ideology. It has no rooting in fact inside.
Speaking of which, do you hold truck with the idea that I've also read purported that the 1973 Roe versus Wade case had a 21 or 22 year effect as well, in that by giving women the freedom to have reproductive control if they weren't ready to have a child, to go on welfare, that also precipitated part of the 90s drop in violent crime? Would that be feasible?
Yeah, that's certainly an obvious piece to the puzzle, because we know that is effective in isolation. So does it work in a bigger scale? Yeah, of course. It works in isolation. It works in a bigger scale too. So yeah, definitely.
What you're talking about, I don't know if the term has ever been coined, but it sounds what I would call holistic policing, rather than just putting a Band-Aid on a specific crime on a specific date, taking an approach that may not yield results in 4 or 5 years, the next election cycle. Do you think that our current electoral system and the need for quick results is sort of like with corporate America? Instead of thinking long-term about corporate policies that may affect the environment, which may affect global warming, which affects the whole planet, that in a similar way, because we have these election cycles where politicians are constantly campaigning and they want to appear tough on crime, that they will not take an approach that may have a generational effect down the line, but isn't going to do them any good in the next election cycle? And how, if so, how do we get out of that win now nonsense?
Right. I mean, so the win now nonsense is completely obvious. When everybody says, you can look at the newspapers right now and they talk about Chicago and the violent crime, which really isn't the most violent crime in the nation, but whatever. It has a big number, so people look at it. But when they see that number, they're saying, what can we do? We must stop this when? Now. And that's not something that is rational or feasible in criminal justice. Everything that you do now will always precipitate a worse situation later, because we can control crime now. That's called being an authoritarian dictator and making an Orwellian police militarized force that continues to escalate and become a continuing presence in our life, that controls our daily means and has plain surveilling us and has us tracking our cell phones and scanning social media to find out what activists are doing. This is the Orwellian future and the path that we know, and we could have predicted 15 years ago if you just look at the model. So the way that we interrupt that is that civilian-led model, where you've got to take the power away from the politicians and make the police department work for you as a mediator. There are a lot of avenues to this. Jake Uger with TYT and I are friends, and part of this partnership that we're going through forward in the future coming up is the same exact thing that we have with TYT. You have like this educational aspect, and that needs to be something that needs to be done to teach everybody. We have a journalist aspect, which means you have to go out there and you have to actually investigate these cases and see what's truly going on, and not buy the propaganda of 6 media-owned entities that control everything you hear. And then you have to get the money out of politics, which is what Wolfpack is about, and creating a constitutional amendment so that at least we don't have legal bribery for our politicians. And then what we do in Veteran Stand is the fourth action of that, which is literally going on the ground and doing things. And we use a very civilian-led model to do that, which is a stakeholder theory to build consensus, to figure out what we're going to do that will benefit all people in that area that we're looking at.
Even people who are, say, more conservative or right-wing leaning would tend to admit that there's police corruption, but they don't seem to ever want to address things. To me, the larger issue is classism and racism as a subset of classism. I'm a white man. I'm in my mid-50s. I grew up in a poor section of New York, and I remember thinking that the cops were sort of this sort of I guess you would call Gestapo-like presence. But it was certainly worse for Hispanics and other minorities, blacks, where I was growing up. So would you be one of those people that would say that, I mean, obviously you would have to admit that racism does exist in U.S. Policing, especially in big cities, as well as small little, podunks. But and if so, though, what type of racism is it? Is it the Ku Klux Klan, white superior kind of racism? Because I'm looking at on my website here, a person of mine recently sent me a thing called the FBI has quietly investigated white supremacist infiltration of law enforcement. Now, this is from a left-wing leaning website, so I don't know how much it is. Or is the racism more simply a product of the bureaucracy, if you know what I'm saying, bureaucratic versus sort of supremacist ideas of whites being superior? What has been your experience in that?
I have no reason to believe that those things aren't mutually exclusive. They're both going to exist at the same time.
Yeah.
But I never really saw overt racism. But I mean, being somebody that didn't tolerate it, I kind of create my own little bubble that
Yeah.
racist people aren't going to come and necessarily hang out around me and say things. You kind of do have those cliques even in law enforcement. But I never really saw that as an overt thing. I always saw it as a product of the system, and that's why these officers don't understand it. That's why they resist it so hard. It's because it looks like it as a result, and because they are the end result, that it's a racist cop, or that the cop is being racist. But that's not true. I mean, I wasn't racist, but I did a lot of racist shit because I was following in that system and executing what that system has told us to do. So the racism comes from within the system, and really the good way to look at that, I think, is that I want to focus on a system that prevents anybody from doing something wrong, even if they have a racist mind, that the system controls their actions, that they don't express that racism. Because the current system we have now will take somebody that isn't racist and make them express racist things. So that's really the trick. I don't care whether you come into my police department a flat-out racist. What I really care about is that you don't treat people the way that racist actions result in treating people. I mean, I can't change minds over a short period of time. But when we have those interactions and we come together, those things all work out without themselves. You get a couple of Syrians, a couple of Chinese, a couple of Americans, or whatever. You put them in a room when they're all 18, they're going to be perfectly fine. It's just a matter of getting them there to actually interact.
Yeah, at the end of World War II, you had the Nuremberg trials and sort of the global standard, the international standard for a person was that you were responsible for your own actions. You couldn't say, well, the death camp guard made me do it, and the death camp guard couldn't say, well, the head of the death camp made me do it, and then the death camp guy would say, well, no, the Subfuhrer made me do it, and then they pointed all the way back to Hitler. Do you think that there's a problem with personal responsibility, or the old rotten apple versus the bad barrel thing? Do we have too many bad barrels? Because inevitably when something happens, the guy who takes the fall is usually the guy in the bottom. It's the cop on the beat. And sometimes it may be very well be guilty. At other times, like you said, he may have been involved in something that it's either, well, I'll lose my job, I have a mortgage to pay, I've got a wife and a kid and another on the way, so if I just go along with the system, I'll be okay. How do we make the bad barrel accountable rather than a rotten apple?
Yeah, so I'm glad you do that, because that's the exact analogy that I use to try and explain to people. I've had these different analogies and metaphors to try and get it through, but everybody wants to stick to the rotten apple, right? And I keep trying to explain like the rotten apple is not a thing. I don't understand why we're talking about that. It's a rotten barrel. That's the whole point. And what we do is that barrel, if we want to visualize earlier, it's constructed with those planks of white supremacy, of mass incarceration, of the creation and maintenance of a slave class, the protection of property, of militarization. These are the planks that build that barrel. And what we end up doing is we have that barrel, but our talks, we all talk about how we're going to make it so that an apple can last longer in that barrel, or we judge about which kind of apples we're going to put in that barrel. And I hope that makes everybody see that it's pointless to even have these arguments about which type of barrel apples you're going to have and how long the apples can last in the barrel. If you're going to keep putting them in that goddamn barrel, you have to create a new barrel, which comes from the people, which is built by those stakeholders, so that they have the interest going forward and can control. Because the reason the Nuremberg trial said, hey, you can't blame higher up, you have to take accountability, is because they weren't judging themselves. The police continue to judge themselves. So when you're judging yourself, it's awfully convenient when your job depends on it, right? It's easy to go ahead and do racist things and prejudiced things when your entire life depends on it and you feel that way and the system is constructed that way. So just like police officers, or criminals, I don't want us getting caught in this idea that because we find a rotten apple, that we can take that rotten apple, who is a criminal, put them into the criminal justice system, and something's going to improve to prevent the next officer from doing that criminal act. See, that's the whole problem, even in policing. We're still looking at the symptom, which is that officer's action, and if we can turn it to always ask, how did we get here, and how do we prevent it from occurring again? If you ask that about the corrupt officer, then your answer is, yes, he followed these orders because of the system. He followed these orders because somebody higher up told him to do it, and he ended up doing it. So we have to make sure that those orders can never come down is the way to solve it in the future. We are so focused on now, and it gets us nowhere.
I want to talk about whistleblowing in general, and I noted that you're a former cop, and we'll talk about why in a moment. But let me just give you an example in the civilian case. A couple of years ago, I was working for a major retailer. I live in the Texas area. Texas is a right-to-work state. And this retailer was breaking some local county fire and safety laws. And I followed the company policy, internal company policy, of reporting it. I had a great boss who supported me, but the higher management of the company eventually did some really not so nice things. They eventually fired me. I went to a lawyer. I found out that I could have had a great case if I had not lived in a right-to-work state where basically a company can break laws, you can be a good guy, report them, and that company can turn around and legally fire you for reporting them for breaking the laws. Is there a similar thing in law enforcement that is an absolute impediment to do the right thing? You want to do the right thing, but you're going to pay a hell of a cost. And how do we remove those obstacles so that people who may not be, let's say, as outspoken or, principled as you may be, but just would be if they had a little bit of support come forward? We talk about the bad barrel, but what internal things can we do to get more people to resist being ordered to break the laws internally, especially in police enforcement?
Sure. I mean, it sounds a little simplistic to always go back to the same answer. Yeah. But if we have that officer where his chain of command is led by the citizens of the community and not by that mayor, see, when they go, all the policy of the right things, we get caught up in that with like Freddie Gray being killed. They're like letting everything go and saying they're going to make new policies, and the new policy says your seatbelt, and you take care of the prisoners, and you do all these other steps. I'm telling you, that stuff was already in the policy. They just created a new policy, and all those rules were already there. So, like the official policy is always tilted to protect the city and look like it's doing the right thing. It's that culture that overwhelms everything. So if you have somebody like Joey Crystal, who testified against another officer in Baltimore for beating a suspect, his career pretty much got ruined, and he got run out of town, and he couldn't go on calls anymore, so he had to quit the police department, and he couldn't get hired at any other police departments because then they blackball you and that kind of, that subterfuge, good old boy network, brotherhood violation kind of thing that people do. So you can speak out. It's just that your career is over because they're going to figure you as a traitor. So it's the unofficial channels and policing that mess everything up. But if you had that board of your citizens and your chain of command went up to them to say that these things are occurring, well, they actually care. Their tax dollars are the ones that are paying for all this. They want to save money. They want the right things done. They want integrity. They don't have a career to protect.
Let's talk about sort of more old-fashioned corruption, though. I mentioned Serpico, and in that era, if you've ever seen the movie or read some of his works, New York City at that time, drugs were just coming into being a major factor in corruption. Are you someone who supports the decriminalization of most drugs, and do you think that would have an immediate effect on crime, or do you think there would be a 5 or 10 year delay?
So we have to be very particular on what we're talking about when it comes to decriminalization terminology. So decriminalization to me is a complete half step. Decriminalization doesn't solve our crime issues. Decriminalization will only help us with the public health aspect, which is overdosing, making sure that people don't get AIDS, things like that, putting low-level offenders into the criminal justice system. That's all decriminalization will allow us to do. But as long as you maintain a black market, you're always going to have the violence that is associated with prohibition of substances like that, just like in alcohol. The highest crime time in modern policing is from alcohol, just like the highest crime and violence is now in the prohibition of drugs. So I'm for complete legalization and just figuring out how we get that and what that system would look like. We can argue with that. It may be different in different jurisdictions, but typically you'd be talking about the more serious drugs being able to be gotten from a pharmacy with counseling, and every time you go get your heroin, and then the doctor's going to give you some speech about how you should be doing that, advise you of your options, make sure you have clean and healthy things to go out about life, and prevent you from being an addict, because being an addict is when this stuff affects your life negatively. Until then, it's just a habit, and doctors can maintain a lot of this stuff as habits, which would have incredible public health benefits for everybody, even economic benefits, because those people don't lose their jobs and all those other things that come associated with it.
You come from a big city background as far as policing. Are there any particular differences between, say, a rural sheriff's department's problems with policing, say, out in Wyoming or West Texas or Utah versus LA, New York, Chicago?
No, I think they're all the same, and that kind of bears out in the numbers because they're all that same principle. So where you'll see some differences is in homogenous communities. And in homogenous communities, we really can't get any evidence of anything that means much anyway because it's just like the same amount of people. But that is a good instance where it points out how the racism is a catalyst factor of the classism, because you can go to, like, they'll lock up all the meth addicts and they'll pursue the drug offenders in the hills of West Virginia, but you don't hear those shootings. You don't see the white cop shooting the drug offender and having all these issues going over bounds. You don't see a 4.5 times more likely to shoot somebody when it's just class isolated. It's when you throw in the other races that you see the minority and the prejudice that's just kind of involved in us all growing up. That's when it's expressed. So you can see how the racism is a catalyst by isolating those type of communities.
Well, let me talk about some of these more high-profile cases. In the last 3 or 4 years, the term sort of hunting Negroes became sort of in vogue on the internet. And as I said, I saw this on a daily basis. I think it's more the 24/7 news cycle that now people are taking, videos of people being harassed. One of the more recent ones was a case here in Texas where a former Heisman Trophy winner, a fellow named Ricky Williams, a former NFL player and a big University of Texas star 15 or so years ago, was just walking around a neighborhood in a small town, staying at a motel, and people just reported that a black guy was just walking around, and it spooked them. And you see 4 or 5 officers on their car cam. You're talking to him, just asking him basically, why are you walking around while black? I mean, it was kind of almost Three Stooges, like funny in a way, but it highlighted this thing that there's just something that sets people off in law enforcement about black people in particular. And I know you'll probably say some of the things that were mentioned before, but it seems to me that when black people see this, and when someone like me who's more sensitive to it for having grown up in that environment, most of society doesn't seem to get it, because a lot of people will write on Facebook that they support the cops in doing this. Even when they see, there was the thing last year, there was a black fellow who was, I think, in charge of an autistic man, and he's laying down on the ground and he ends up getting shot somehow. It's just, why is a gun being pulled? Why is a gun even being brandished in that kind of a situation? It just makes no sense. And it gets back to the idea that there's just something wrong in the greater society, even beyond policing.
Yeah, I mean, policing is always an expression of the society that you're talking about. So that's how it comes out. And everything they allow policing to do and don't say anything about is kind of what your undertones of society are condoning. And like that, I really like that you brought up these 911 calls, because you get those 911 calls, and it's a good example example of how police just follow blindly as a pawn, because what they'll do is they get a 911 call that says somebody has a BB gun in Walmart. So I'll use John Crawford as an example. And they get that call, and the cops are like, oh my God, somebody has a gun in Walmart, let's go. And because when it's a black person, we have this idea that we've seen panned out where black suspects look older, they look more aggressive. You hear cops say things like he had superhuman strength, and that's because that's what TV does to us. You know, it sows those seeds as we go through life. I mean, it's just what it inundates us. So the cops are hearing things that they've heard their whole life, thinking that that's what you do, and so they see John Crawford. When it's a black guy, then he's scary, and so they get all nervous. And because the law has codified them being nervous into being able to kill somebody, then the system just covers it up, and we say, well, that's fine, but that's the law. And our society has done this huge misperception where we have taken our laws, and because they're laws, we have said that they are now ethics. But really the way it should be is we should have ethical values which are codified into laws. But we have taken our laws and codified them into our ethics, which is just morally corrupt in its base. But when the officer goes and he sees a white guy, then he thinks to himself, oh, well, this guy could have just purchased the shotgun and picked it up from the shelf and is now just walking around like I would do. But when it's a black guy, it's like an animal or a monster is doing it when they're caught up in that perception. And human beings, like, they're grossly undertrained. We have to understand that human beings have to go through a lot to get to a point, or maybe they're not even, like, all of them aren't even genetically capable of being able to evaluate situations subjectively or objectively in the highest of stress situations. When you see officers do things that you think are completely rational, you have to remember that the brain doesn't even see reality. And what the human being sees is a complete illusion. It's influenced by everything they have preconceptions about. It's influenced by the drugs that are running through their system, which the brain creates. And maybe these officers do see something more violent to them. They do see it really, really bad. So we have to understand that you have to train these people out, or maybe there's people that just cannot be cops and be in situations where we have a gun-saturated culture and a cop has to be on edge all the time. Some people just can't handle being on edge.
Well, let's move beyond the sort of old-fashioned black and white issue in America, and the newest expression of bigotry in the last 15 or so years has been against Muslims. And certainly, you know, every time there's you know, some Boston Marathon or that couple in California that killed a dozen more people a year or so ago, the idea is always, oh, well, there's the proof that all Muslims are violent, psychotic, killing machines, and yes, that gets more play. But then when you have a Timothy McVeigh or the kid who just recently killed 5 or 6 people in Quebec, was it? That is sort of downplayed. Do you think that the fear of Islam, how do you think that's going to play out? Is that going to become sort of the new black in terms of law enforcement, that everything that any person of even like someone like Obama's family, who may not be Muslim, practicing Muslim, but from a mostly Muslim country, is going to be suspect? And are we going to, do you think that the star chambers that we had after 9/11 are going to come back in some way? Does this trouble you?
I don't think that they'll come back, but I do think that the Muslim as an appearance issue is a factor. So I've kind of talked about this a little bit before, and getting in how our domestic policy and our foreign policy, when it comes to cops and soldiers, are the exact same policy, doing the same problems, the same misperceptions of everything that's going on. But so if you look at our things in life now, so if you're a white male that has money and your family is educated and you have some kind of fund coming down to you, then you're like, that's zero, you know, and everything else is factors which contribute to that. And if you're a woman, then you have some factors. The class is a factor, like you highlighted earlier. Race is a factor. Religion will be a factor. All these things that we're prejudiced on in our society will be expressed by policing, as long as policing is this thing that we have made it to be, and we can demonize others. I mean, that's the point of even races themselves, with an intentional creation. I can't believe people don't realize that races didn't exist 200 years ago. It's a complete fabrication to make us argue against ourselves been constructed in a capitalist society, and we can't, I'm sure people forget if I start going off socialism on them coming from a vet and a cop when you get to these issues, but that's what we're talking about, is this society of ours wants to divide us, make us argue with one another, when we're all really on the same damn team. And I think the vast majority of people below 40 are really starting to catch on that we are the same damn team, and we won't allow this, but we're going to have problems for a while until we can catch up to that.
So let's talk. We're recording this just a few weeks into Donald Trump's presidency, and I know that you've seen, when you spoke of New York City, you didn't seem to be a big fan of Rudolph Giuliani, and I was never a fan of Giuliani, even when he was the Attorney General when I lived in New York. But what do you see happening in the short-term future, the next year or two? I mean, obviously Trump isn't going to get Mexico to build a wall to keep people out. I mean, that's just ridiculous. But do you see a more sort of militaristic approach towards policing in general, whether it's along the Mexico border, whether it's in inner cities, whether it's people coming through airports? Do you think we're going to get more regimented, or do you have some near-term hope that some good things might occur, and if so, what?
I do catch a good bit of flack for this, and I understand that these are issues of opinion, but I think our society is really shocked because it went from the friendliest face of fascism to the ugliest face of fascism, and nothing has really changed in the end results of things. Yeah, I mean, we banned people before. We turned the Jews away and sent them back to die. This is what America does. This is nothing new. The police models continue to have that Orwellian future where we went up to Standing Rock and we fought that on December 4th to get the temporary injunction with the veterans, but that was Obama. He was willing to let the Morton County Sheriff's Department sit there and spray people with water in 20-degree temperatures that were completely nonviolent. Do we get much? I mean, what's Trump going to do? I mean, spray him with gasoline? I mean, what do we like? It's not going to be much different. This is because this is our system. This is what a good majority of people still believe we should be doing, or they're too ambivalent to care about. Because I mean, if you don't care, I think that's privilege. That's what privilege is the ability to not give a damn about any of it. It's the ability to be a Bismarck. And when you say, I don't want the pipeline running through my backyard, then they say, okay, we'll run it through the Native Americans' backyard. As long as we continue to do those kind of things, I mean, like, how the hell is any of that different? And hopefully by our command staff having their hoods on and we seeing them who they really are, it can unite everybody and bring everybody together, because the people that were on the streets protesting about things that Trump was doing, they were protesting when Obama was executing 16-year-old children that were American citizens with remote control devices. So I'm afraid those people weren't there before and won't be there after there's a nice ugly facial fascism, but I'm hoping that they can at least look at it and start identifying what these things look like in the end result, so we can have more of a solidarity to make these improvements. That's my best hope that I can give, is just that we see it now. Everybody else had Exxon bribe off the Secretary of State, and he just said, well, put Exxon as Secretary of State, cut out the middleman. And it's like, well, now you see, the actions are the same, and all they were was the middleman anyway.
Yeah, I know most people who think that American Indians will say they're still around, or I thought they were all working in casinos. That's about where the modern American public is. Since you've spoken a bit more beyond in social terms, let me just ask you about your own political views. During this recent election, I know, me personally, I'm an independent. I voted for Jill Stein of the Green Party, but most people buy into what I would call the duopoly of Republicans and Democrats. Let me just give you a couple of examples. I saw a YouTube video that was very interesting, and it showed like the top 15 planks of Hillary Clinton's platform, but then the filmmaker showed the real Hillary planks, which were identical, and it was George W. Bush's 2000 platform versus Hillary's 2016 platform, and there was not a whit's worth of difference. And so I've always been of the opinion that yes, the Republicans will be against abortion, the Democrats will be for abortion rights. There are slight differences on drug policies and whatnot, but it's money in the system that feeds these two parties, and it breeds extremism. When you anyone knows that if you just have a scale weighted with two ends, you're going to go either up or down one way or the other. But if you had 3 or 4 minor parties that could get between 8 and 15% each, there would be a tendency to moderate, so you wouldn't get such extremism. What is your general political view in America? Are you someone who would thinks that the current duopoly is corrupt as a whole? Are you someone who will vote outside the box, say, for a Green Party or, let's say, a Libertarian, if you would lean that way?
Yeah, so let's say recently I did a panel called White in America not too long ago on Sirius XM with Karen Hunter. And one of these expressions that came up is, I got criticized a little bit in the past, I have, for voting for Romney back in the day. And when I was on this panel, they were slamming Obamacare. And I was like, Republicans, you guys are slamming Obamacare? Like, that's Romney care. I'm 100% positive 12 years ago, you had statements that would have said that you supported all of these things when it was a Republican plan, and now that it's a Democratic plan, you're not for it. Your identity politics couldn't be more clear than showing that. So, yeah, I mean, I totally view it as a false paradigm. The lesser of two evils is what gets you the two worst candidates in history. I mean, could it be more obvious? I voted for Jill Stein. I've become a progressive. I think if we continue to do this lesser of two evils kind of concept, then, I mean, we're just fools looking for our own doom. It's fundamentally a corrupt ideology, but yet because the media and those two parties would keep telling people that it's perfectly fine, like, people follow along with it. I have no understanding of why that is. I think we have to take totally new approaches that are completely holistic, that are more socialism driven. I mean, maybe capitalism isn't the ultimate evil, but if it isn't, then what it is we need to go in ebbs and tides. We went too much capitalism, we need to go a little socialism. If we go a little socialism, we'll come out and we'll get a little more capitalistic. But we can't continue this escalation of continuing capitalism where all those profits, as we know, the economic gains all go to the elite. It's all the 0.01%. And one of my master's program theses I did was talking about productivity gains and how that looks now. And individuals in the 70s who were making minimum wage, who tell people who have $15 an hour they're talking out of their ass, they were making the productive equivalent of $21 an hour. Yeah. Like, are you seriously scolding people who are working $7 an hour, and you were making the equivalent of $21 an hour, and now we've got we're arguing with each other about the value of $7 an hour because we bought into this stupid ass paradigm.
Yeah, I mean, I was on Obamacare after I had lost my job a couple of years ago, and it wasn't the best thing, and it's probably not the best thing now, but it was better than what was before, and it's something that could be fixed. And I always find it odd because, you know, if you went back, 80, 90 years ago before Social Security, the poorest class in America were the old who couldn't work anymore. Now, the retirees are generally the most well-off portion of society, precisely because you had Social Security, which is by far the most beneficial government program in the history of this country. And then you talk about Obamacare. I get people talking about socialist health care and whatnot. Well, everyone I've ever known, whether it's from Canada or Israel or from Europe, says the exact opposite. Yes, there are going to be some countries that have problems, but no one is dying for lack of health care as they have in this country. And on the WHO's list of best healthcare systems, we, I think, for 3 years running, have been in the high 30s. We're like 37th. France is number 1. Israel has a better system than us. All of these small European countries in Scandinavia, and even Cuba, a third world communist country, ranks higher, significantly higher than the U.S., and it just amazes me about this. And it gets back to the holistic thing that we were talking about earlier, because you can't have just one aspect of society, whether it's police enforcement, somehow doing something that's out of sync if you have a whole society that is somehow out of step and not caring. We talk about the right of the individual, but you have to empower that individual, because not everyone is going to be physically or mentally or personally capable of achieving even just having a regular life. So let me just ask, I guess, in a holistic sense, because you how old are you? In your, I guess, late 20s or so, 30ish?
Thanks, I'll take it. I'm 37.
Oh, okay. You're younger. You're older than I thought. But so you've been around for quite a while. But do you look then that I mean, do you have a generally positive outlook in the long term, say for your lifetime, that things will get better? Because it seems to me that we go through these hiccups every so often. But if you go back and say quarter century increments, life tends to get a little bit better.
Yeah, so let's put that into perspective real quick. One thing I want to say about your holistic thing is we actually demonstrated this, and it has been documented in science. And because of El Salvador, when El Salvador had their country essentially collapsed, their entire government did, and so they had to rebuild it from scratch. And you usually can't do studies in what that would be because it would be unethical. You can't go destroy a society and see what science you get out of it.
Yeah.
But since that happened, a lot of scientists studied it, and one of their biggest lessons was the holistic aspect of tying in policy that would be, cognizant would be cogent with public health and policing and flow throughout the entire country as a holistic approach. Because when you identify the problem, all the agencies need to see that as a problem and approach it in the same manner, which they're obviously not doing here. But I always want to remind people, we are living in the longest period of peace. It has never been less violent in human history. Every generation says that the next generation is worse, and every generation that says that is completely wrong. and we're always worried about the beast that's at the door, and we really just keep having a progressive society that gets better and better. So if you follow the trend line, most of our worries are relative nonsense. But climate change, militarization of police, our continuing lesser of two evils, these are significant concerns that are destroying the fabric of what it means to be American. I'm not somebody that stands for the pledge because it's a stupid lie. It doesn't have justice for all. These things aren't true. The national anthem is a racist damn document. I'm not standing for it. And maybe I'll stand for it when the things are actually true. But people in society will look at me and there are tons of other veterans that are that way and totally think that we would be offended because someone doesn't stand for the flag, and all the veterans are like, no, we fought and we died so people don't have to stand for the flag, so they can say these things, and a lot of us don't do it ourselves. So, the point of that being is we don't buy this nationalistic kind of patriotism that is the old paradigm, and we're kind of butting up against that, where our country thinks vets and children and millennials should be behaving a certain way, and the millennials and vets are everything but the opposite. We recognize that patriotism is the same thing that the revolutionaries did. Throwing tea off that boat. Yeah, to us, to Britain, we're a terrorist. But to us, that's revolution. That's standing up for what's right and making our ethics codified into our laws and not making our laws codified to our ethics.
It's interesting that when you say that, I recently read an article that had Britain won the Revolutionary War, probably slavery would have ended decades earlier than it actually did, because a lot of our founding fathers were actually fighting for the right to have slaves against poor King George. But let me just end this interview. I've lived long enough to see there's always foot dragging on how to change things in society in general, policing. We don't have enough money for this because we're fighting the Viet Cong. We're fighting the communists. We don't have enough money for this. We're fighting the drug war. We don't have enough money for this because Islamic terrorists are coming. But always we do. We just don't prioritize things correctly. Do you think that it's more money needed or just better planning, and that we have the resources now to change policing and society in general for the better?
No more money is needed whatsoever. And policing usually takes over half of a city's budget. That's preposterous. And it has the wrong goals. So police budgets are always increasing. So remember, if we had this actual design where you were leading the police department, abolition would be your goal. The abolishment of policing is unrealistic, but it should always be your goal. Your goal should be as little as possible, as little as guns on the street, because every gun makes the situation more dangerous when it comes in. So we should have this idea that the police budget would continually de-escalate, because there are things we can do, like spend a bunch of money now, fight lead poisoning, and then we don't need to do these things later. The prison industrial complex, go to prison pipeline, we can see it all expressed, and those things prevent us from doing it. I just think that in the age of information, you money when we can look up and see that you spent $750 billion on bombs? Like, yeah, here's an easy solution. Not spending $750 billion on bombs. You know,
Yeah.
It's not hard, but as long as you're being ruled by that money in politics, and then they created a prison industrial complex, and it's fine, so that they can get away with that. But we interrupt those things. I really think that once we get in there and hit hard, it's going to be a cascading effect towards a more progressive kind of mentality that's reliant on science. It's just like it takes so goddamn long to get there because life lives longer. Baby boomers have money. They're still in control. Our presidents are 70 years old, and most of our industry leaders are this old generation that won't let go of power. And once they do, I think you're going to see a rapid change in the kind of the culture.
Yeah, it's policing should always be the force of last resort. It's too often to me the first resort,
Right.
and it gets back to what I was saying about these ticket quotas, and this is what I meant actually by corruption starting small and at the bottom, in that because we have someone who doesn't want to stand up to a sergeant and say, no, I don't want to give a ticket to someone who's, meter just expired 30 seconds ago, or it hasn't even expired. This then propagates this idea that the policing almost becomes a way to fund municipal projects or whatnot, rather than actually solving things. But
not almost.
Yeah.
Yeah, they do that in certain areas. We demonstrated it in Ferguson. Yeah, it's a regressive tax that they use to fund the rest of the city and harp off the poor. We do that in Baltimore, where you get Under Armour is getting a $600 million tip while there's people paying taxes on their houses in right next to the CVS that was burned down. But a rich white dude can buy $600 million worth of stuff and doesn't have to pay a single drop of taxes on it.
Yeah.
We have the people in Flint still paying water bills for poisoned water.
Yeah.
I mean, this is exactly the system as how it was designed and is being expressed, right?
Well, let me just finally end. You're calling me, or we're speaking to you in a motel room, you said. So are you out, what are you doing currently, and what's your next sort of, are you going to be appearing before some kind of Senate committee in the future, or what is your next activities?
I don't think Senate committees are ready to listen to me yet. I still think we're a little bit away from that. I kind of put police reform a little bit on the back burner because we're at the stage where I'm really comfortable with the model and understanding how it would work. It's a matter of the people making it push to see what that is. So looking for movement, the Veteran Stand, a Standing Rock thing that we started, raised $1 million. We developed a nonprofit. So really I'm focused on being the executive director of Veteran Stand. I'm up here doing media because I'm about to go to LA to continue to do media and move out there so I can saturate myself in being able to collect funds and do that stuff you have to do in order to fund Veteran Stand. And we go out and we will circumvent the system. So I think we're thinking about Flint now is next, and we have people up there doing that stakeholder issue to figure out what solutions look like, and we'll raise money, and the vets, we volunteer and stand up, and we'll just be the free labor to go and fix these problems. We're tired of, I'm at the point where I can't rely on government to do anything. I can't rely on the people to stand up enough yet. So we found a group of tens of thousands of veterans who want to do this kind of work. As long as I can raise the money, they'll do the work. So I'm dedicating 150% of my efforts to raise that money and build that infrastructure so that they can do these actions to go ahead and make productive gains until we get to a point where we can get some power in politics to actually enact change that's wider.
Well, michaelawoodjr.net is your website. I'll link to it below this video. I want to thank you for spending an hour talking about your life, career, and your views. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Have a good day. Be safe.